They shoved the ledger onto the coals while the traveler watched, pages curling into black lace and the smell of singed glue rising into
You
dust.
haven't kept account of who
Suspicion
owes
pressed
what.
at the traveler's hands.
I know
He
what
folded
I
his
owe.
fingers
Show
until
me.
his knuckles ached
Show
and
me
did
where
not
it's
step
written.
forward.
There
The
was
village
Thomas,
eldress tilted her head
his
away from the
wife,
flame.
Mary,
Someone
three
murmured a
children.
prayer. The
And
ledger
then
burned in
Samuel,
front of
who tried
everyone,
to flee.
and the ledger's
By
name
order of
pages
the
floated
Crown,
like
this
small,
inventory demands
charred
a tenth of
birds
all
into the
grain,
hearth's
a
smoke.
third of all
He had
livestock,
arrived
and
with
all
a satchel
metals
of
by the
blank
solstice.
pages and a fountain pen, expecting trade notes and weather observations. Within minutes the evening had twisted into a public erasure, a ritual that was a choice as much as a custom. The traveler checked the strap of his satchel with a deliberate motion, listening to the scrape of boots on cobbles. Suspicion guided him now. He would not accept what was shown at face value. The traveler was known to others as a chronicler by habit rather than by title. He walked with a slight stoop from years on the road and kept his iron, grey hair tucked beneath a threadbare cap. He unfastened his satchel slowly, fingers working to hide the small brass ink pot and the pen as if their presence might announce him. He did not speak at first. He watched the village eldress, who held the ledger's last heat in both hands and would not meet his eyes. The eldress wiped her palms on her apron and said, "We do not keep those things." Her voice did not rise. The traveler stepped closer to the communal hearth and asked, "Who decided this, eldress?" "The council decided," she said, and the word council landed like a stone between them. A quiet scribe pressed through the crowd at the edge of the square and met the traveler's shoulder with a folded scrap. She did not speak. She walked away as if the action was small. He felt his suspicion sharpen into alarm. He moved after her into an alley and slipped the scrap into his palm. The scrap fit the shape of a name and a date written in a narrow, slanted hand. In the alley the traveler flattened the paper against his knee. The ink smelled faintly of coal and of river water. He read a woman's name, a list of wheat delivered to a neighbor, a note about a boy who broke his wrist. These were ordinary notations, exact, domestic, stubborn in their concreteness. They contradicted the tidy, distant accounts he had already collected from foreign warehouses, reports that spoke of neat rituals and nameless elders. The scrap told him the ledger burning was not simple ceremony. It was an act that changed who the village could name and remember. The traveler moved to the inn after nightfall. In the small rented room the lamp threw an oval of lamplight onto a table. He unfolded the scrap and set it beside his pen, then opened his satchel and took out a blank page. His hands trembled only when he realized how much he wanted to write everything down and how much danger that impulse might bring. Doubt nudged at him, doubt that recording would help, doubt that he had the right to take another community's details away. He pushed the doubts into the corner and copied the 2 short lines onto his page. He read the names aloud under his breath. Gnarly wheat. Thomas, wrist, he wrote the time beside them. The act of copying became a small resistance. He left the lamp low and the window cracked to the cool night, and let the sound of the river steady him. The scrap's neat hand contradicted the formal foreign sketches he had seen. The margins contained dates, and the dates named ordinary afternoons, market bargains, births, and a funeral note about a man who drowned months earlier. Concrete notes about daily life kept surfacing. The traveler realized something else. Outsiders had recorded more than they admitted. Morning arrived with market calls. He walked the open, air stalls and asked questions in his slow, careful way. A marketwoman placed a basket of dried apples on the stall and did not look at him when he asked about ledgers. "We do not keep them any more," she said. Chopping the air with a practiced motion, "The council forbids ledgers." Her fingers were stained with sugar and the scar along her thumb showed where a blade had once cut her during harvest. Who enforces that? The traveler pressed. "The eldress does, with the council's blessing," the marketwoman replied, and her voice tightened. "You should not pry, traveler. You should leave us be." The trader recognized the traveler later beside the river. He sat on a crate and unrolled a battered sketchbook with charcoal smudges along its spine. "You look like one of those who keeps lists." The trader. "I kept a book once." He tapped the sketchbook with a thick finger. "Merchants save more than coin. We note houses that welcome us, recipes, names of useful men. Come, show me your tools." The traveler lifted his satchel and showed the ink pot, the pen, the folded scrap. The trader ran a finger across a page and found a small sketch of a bridge and a notation beside it. White ropes, tied high at 3. The traveler's face tightened. You are not the only one who takes notes. The trader, we hide the useful things. We protect them. He looked at the traveler with plain directness. Do you want to see a trunk? By late morning, the trader led him to a riverside warehouse. The air tasted of fish oil and river silt. They climbed a narrow ladder into a damp loft. The traveler's boots left dark prints on the wooden planks. In the far corner, under a moth-eaten blanket, a trunk waited with a strap broken and the brass dulled by salt. The trader pried it open and the room filled with the smell of paper gone soft from moisture and the sharper scent of old ink. Inside were foreign notebooks, pages folded, sketches of roofs, a child's name jotted next to a recipe for nettle soup. Some pages had been torn or stained by water. The traveler ran a finger along the torn edge and found a margin note that matched the scrap given in the alley. The same slanted hand. A second, smaller notebook contained a list of market vendors and straightforward accounts. Who sold salt this month? Who could mend a wheel? Which house held a borrowed plough? These were practical, ordinary entries that named actual people and tasks. How many of these did you get? The traveler, enough that I feared carrying them here. The trader, enough that I worry for the owners. Foreign hands make the wrong noise sometimes. They heard footsteps on the stairs. The village eldress's silhouette filled the doorway, and then she stepped into the loft, apron dusted with ash from the ledgers burning. What are you doing in my town's loft? She demanded. The trader answered, we are preserving things outsider's note. We mean no harm. He closed the trunk with his palm and looked at the eldress steadily. You mean to show us what we have chosen to forget, she said. Her voice did not shake, but her lips were thin. You think you know what belongs to this place, stranger. Tension rose in a quick, sharp shift. The traveler felt fear like a cold rod along his spine, then replaced that fear with careful composure. He did not raise his voice. Eldress, I am only a recorder. I write what I see. If there is danger in the pages, tell us what it is. Danger is the ability to name what should be gone, she said. Danger is letting others keep what we have agreed to lose. The quiet scribe stepped forward from the shadows. She folded her arms and said, we are not agreed. I kept a scrap. I slipped it to him. Her hand was steady. We keep things in secret. We keep them from the council. The eldress turned to the scribe. You risk everyone with your small rebellions. You risk the council's wrath, and I risk the truth being erased. The scribe words became a push and pull. The traveler sensed the argument like a physical exchange of pressure. For a moment he thought they would not speak plainly. Then they spoke in direct, short lines, voices clashing in the damp loft. You hide names and call it safety. The eldress, we hide names to keep people alive. The scribe answered, who decides which names die? The trader, we decide. The eldress, the confrontation shifted the dynamic in the room. Anger replaced suspicion in the traveler's chest. He recorded the exchange with a quick hand, copying phrases and names. The traveler's actions were driven by a new clarity. To preserve the small, ordinary records that would otherwise vanish. He found himself copying not to show the village, but to protect the quiet scribe. Then the eldress lunged toward the trunk and overturned it. Pages scattered to the floor. A knock of water pooled where the trunk lid struck the wood. The traveler moved to pick up a page, and the eldress snatched it first. She read a name and slammed the paper back down. You will not take our people from us and fling their names about like trade goods, she said. The trader stepped between them. Eldress, these are not trade goods. They are notes. Let us speak. No. Leave, she said. I will not have your notebooks carried through my streets. A small crowd had gathered outside the loft by the time their arguments spilled down the ladder. Voices threaded with accusation and pleadings. The traveler felt pressure, then a third shift of emotion, from anger into a measured resolve. He understood now that the correct action was not to force the issue in public and coax confession, but to shield the quiet scribe and to take only what would endanger no one. His hands moved with that calculation. He copied surviving entries in the dim light, careful, writing names and mundane transactions, the way a midwife lists births in a ledger. The quiet scribe whispered a name and a date into his ear so that he could add it. Nally's daughter was given a name in July, she said. Write July. He wrote July. He tied a small bundle of pages with twine and pressed it to the scribe's palm. "Hide these in the oven of the baker." "He owes me a favor," he said. The scribe's fingers closed around the pages. Her eyes flicked to the eldress, then to the traveler. She nodded hardly audibly. "Thank you," she said. That night the traveler walked to the solitary pier with a trunk heavier than it had been that morning. The river reflected lamplight in narrow bands. The wind smelled of riverweed and wet wood. He opened the trunk one last time. The pages he had copied lay stacked, the ink still glinting in the lamplight. He thought of the ledger burning in the square, and of the names that had been read aloud before they blackened. Names of men who had once fished from a certain cove, of a woman who mended nets at night, of the boy with the broken wrist. He put his hand over the small bundle of originals he had concealed for the scribe, and then closed the trunk. He had choices. To carry everything away and publish it where foreign hands would read and misname the place, or to leave the bulk of the notebooks where they lay and take only the precise, domestic notes that would not expose any living person to danger. He chose the latter. He locked the trunk and set it beside the mooring rope. A boatman came at his signal. The traveler stepped into the small skiff and set the trunk at his feet. He did not look back for long. He listened to the slap of oars and the soft, constant breathing of the river. He held one folded scrap in his hand and slid it into the inner pocket of his coat. For a while suspicion lived beside him like a companion. Later, a cautious hope took its place. The night took him away with a low, steady sound of oars through water. He would write what he could without naming those who still needed anonymity. He would protect the quiet scribe's secret and the marketwoman's silence. The village would remain with its choice to erase certain papers and to save others in hidden places. Outsiders would keep a partial record, and he would arrange those parts so that they caused the least harm. At dawn he watched the last dark shapes of the village recede. He felt the trunk's weight against his knees, and the resolve to carry what names he could without exposing more than necessary. Outside the immediate events of the loft there remained a larger question that would shape the traveler's next moves. Who had persuaded the council that ledgers must be burned? He could list the names he had taken down and the places they described, but the motive behind the eradication remained a concrete puzzle. He set the trunk across his lap and let the river's motion clear his mind for a new plan. He would keep traveling, asking, copying, and hiding. The traveler ran his thumb along the edge of a page and folded it back into the trunk as the boat rounded a bend. A single lantern on the distant shore winked and then vanished. He tied the trunk strap and let the skiff move into the gray. He made a small, practical decision before the water carried him beyond the village. He wrote one line in his own hand on the first page of a new notebook, in thick, deliberate strokes. Pages copied by the traveler to preserve names at risk. Stored for the quiet scribe, he slid the notebook into his satchel, closed the satchel's flap, and pushed the skiff into the river's steady current. The oars dipped. The ledger's ash still held a heat in the memory of the town, but a few names now lived in ink on a blank page. And that act would be enough for tonight. The boat moved away and left the shore to its decisions. The traveler did not shout. He let the question of motive remain with those who had made their choices in the square. And he steered himself toward other harbors, where foreign notebooks might again gather the details ordinary people left behind. The chapter ends with the traveler pulling a hood over his cap as the river tightened around the skiff, and the pier's rope thudded once against the post before slackening, a sound that closed the village behind him and opened the next stage of his work. They forced open the traveler's trunk at the pier and a port official snapped, "What papers do you carry?" The traveler pushed his shoulder against the quay timber while the skiff scraped wood and salt. Suspicion sat in his mouth like grit. He said nothing, only tightened his grip on the trunk strap and watched the men. Within 4 sentences the problem was plain. Officials were collecting outsider records and his notes were the immediate target. That suspicion of seizure and erasure moved him to act before argument could crush the small details he had taken down. He tasted smoke and ink and remembered the ledger that had burned the night before, pages curling at the edges until the village eldress let them fall into coals. The memory of that flame threaded his choices now. He would not let another ledger be turned to black lace without a fight. He had no uniform and no right in their lists. He had a satchel of loose papers, sketches folded into grease marks, and names written in a small, compact hand. He kept one hand on the brass ink pot, as if that small weight steadied him. "These are merely notes," he said. "They are records of people, not politics." Port Official Marin bared his teeth at the word. "People, this place orders what stays. Marin, you will hand them over." The other officer, Cade, leaned in, and the smell of wet wool and tobacco came with him. Their fingers found the leather corners of the trunk and pressed. The traveler felt his shoulders bend with the pressure, and a first shift of emotion came. Doubt narrowed into fear. He glanced at the ferryman standing back, at the low boat tied with a loop of rope, and measured options he did not want to make. Joran, the ferryman, had the look of someone who had carried other people's weight and kept his own counsel. He stepped forward and put his rough palm on Marin's forearm. "Not yet, Joran." He did not argue the law, he argued time. Marin's jaw rubbed against his collar. "We have orders." Cade flicked a list of names from the magistrate onto the wet deck. The traveler's name and no fewer than 8 foreign entries were written in ink that had run in the salt. Joran shoved the list into his coat and studied it in silence. He then looked at the traveler and said, "You can talk. Or we wait, and they take everything." The traveler chose talking because movement felt safer than waiting. He opened the trunk with fingers that did not tremble visibly, though his hands felt raw. Inside were folded sketches, grocery lists in the villagers' script, an inventory of tools in a cartmaker's shorthand, and a small, sewn packet of pressed herbs. He handed over a page showing a child's shoe beside a loaf of bread. "This is a habit of the baker's boy," he said. Joran nodded like a man cataloging cargo. Marin's face did not change. Cade thumbed through pages and his expression hardened. "These are not lists for business, Cade. These are records." "They stay." The traveler offered the brass ink pot on the table between them, the little object catching lamplight that had not yet been lit. He could feel the room wobble around that small negotiation, the moment where paper meant protection to him and danger to others. They tugged the trunk toward the quay steps. A crowd had gathered as dawn brightened faintly. Fishermen, ledger boys carrying empty crates, and the young market woman who had once traded the traveler a sketching blank stood clustered back. She stepped forward now, despite the eldress's frown. "Let him speak." "Enya." She had coal-stained hands and a cloth tied at her hair. "I have seen his drawings. He draws how we set bread to cool on the sill." The eldress Mira had her palms folded in front of her and watched with a patience that felt like a withheld strike. Mira's voice drew out slow and even. "Enya, we know what ink can do. Registers punished before. We burned them because they named people who were taken. You know this." At the name of punishment, the traveler's throat tightened, and he recalled the ledger's blackened edges from the night before. He saw a face he had sketched, an old woman whose ledger entry had become a sentence, and that memory pushed him toward the next shift, from fear into resolve. Back at the inn, the debate hardened into a confrontation. The common room smelled of boiled stew and wet cloaks. 2 local notables, Marcos and Tolin, rose to argue with the eldress Mira. "Marcos, we cannot shelter paper that invites the magistrate. You for quiet. Quiet was safety once. Mira, quiet and burning. We paid for that with sons and daughters." The traveler listened and set a page of names on the table. He slid it forward so everyone could see the handwriting. Small loops, a shorthand for kinship, notes about who mended whose nets. "This is how people ate," he said. "This is how they paid the miller. This is not threat. It is picture of living." Enya's hand brushed the page and left a smudge of flour that settled into the ink like a small proof of presence. Marco spat slightly into his palm. "A picture of living draws eyes. Eyes send lists. Lists send hands." Words tumbled faster between them now. The room's temperature seemed to rise with every short, clipped sentence. In the argument, the traveler found his voice in empirical detail. "Marcos, look. The baker's list shows loaf sizes. The cartmaker's note shows which wheels are patched. If you surrender them, the magistrate will read names and dates and decide whose debts are dangerous. If you destroy them, you remove evidence against the guilty, but you also remove evidence that might prove innocence." He felt the words land like stones. "Mira," said Tolin. "And what would you have us keep?" "Your idea will have blood on it again." Enya slid a small folded scrap from her sleeve and set it on the wood beside the traveler's open pages. The room stopped breathing around the scrap. It was a sketch in the traveler's hand, a doorway with chalk marks by the lintel. The same looped handwriting matched his notation about a child's rattle. The scrap changed the room's axis. The eldress's jaw loosened. "Where did you get this?" "Mirror." Enya looked at the traveler and then at the eldress from a woman who kept it hidden. She liked the way the stranger drew outdoors. Her voice did not waver. The eldress turned to Marcos. "So some among us kept things. They kept what they could. We thought it better to hide than trust the magistrate." Marcos's face slackened and then hardened. "Hiding breeds factions. You make us clandestine and the magistrate grows suspicious. You ask for trouble." Tolin leaned in. "Enya, you could be named for this." Enya's fingers curled around the scrap. "Then name me," she said. "Simple and flat, at least this way the child's shoe. The miller's ledger, the bread sizes are not lost." The first external event after several speaking paragraphs was the arrival of the magistrate's formal list at the inn doorway, rapping the wood twice and bringing a sharp new tempo. The magistrate arrived with a young official who had a clean collar and a ledger bound in fresh leather. Magistrate Sorrel read aloud the names required to surrender outsider records. His voice carried like a ruler across the room. "By order of the court, Sorrel, all outsider records will be delivered for inventory." He brushed his sleeve and looked at the traveler. "You will surrender those papers now." The traveler held the folded scrap tight in a fist under the table. His breath came measured. He knew the cost of confrontation. He heard Jorin clear his throat in the doorway. The ferryman had not left the pier. He stood there, a silent witness in a space of water and rope. 3 men stepped up to inspect the trunk: Magistrate Sorrel, Port Official Marin, and a municipal scribe. They listed visible pages, declared them contraband, and called for immediate inventory. The traveler did not submit immediately. He had the memory of the ledger's pages curling into flame at the last chapter's dusk. He remembered the eldress tilting her head away and the smell of singed glue. That image moved him to keep one thing from the officials. He thought of the woman's face he'd sketched. He thought of the child's shoe. He thought of Enya's flour-smudged hand. He acted by hiding the folded scrap inside his coat between the lining and the cloth, sliding it into a seam no official would quickly find. The act was small but decisive. It marked the first secret attempt to preserve a voice otherwise destined to be catalogued and disposed. Sorrel barked at Marcos and Tolin to hold the crowd back. "We will not have obstruction." "Sorrel." He set men to inventory. They moved like clerks who had learned violence by habit, lifting papers and naming them out loud. The traveler watched each page go into a crate. He moved his chin to Enya and mouthed, "Remember names." She nodded with a tiny motion that broke into a tremor as the officials packed the trunk. Inside, men found lists of births, a baker's loan, a notation of a man named Havel who had once taken a pound of grain and not repaid it. When the magistrate read Havel's name, the eldress flinched and turned the color of old linen. "He was taken once because of a ledger," she said, and her voice snapped with a sudden, public memory. The room broke into whispers and someone coughed loudly to cover breath. After the magistrate left with a crate of papers, the village's social lines rearranged. Marcos moved away from Miranda. Tolin remained near the hearth. Enya stayed close to the traveler and offered him a cup of cooled tea. "You should have shown them the seam," she said in a low voice. "You could have said nothing and left with your trunk." The traveler stirred his tea and felt the weight of every name that had passed across the magistrate's table. He had an internal shift in calculation, doubt to anger. He set the cup down with more force than intended. "They will read dates and place us on lists for months," he said. "They will name fathers and mothers and send men to fetch them." Enya's hand tightened on the cup's rim. Her fingers left a small oil ring on the wood. 2 notables who had earlier spoken for surrender had a private conversation with Jorin and Ortega, a local notable who now acted as a distraction. They spoke in low, quick sentences by the doorway. Then one of them performed a small, deliberate diversion. While Magistrate Sorrel's men were busy with trunks and binders, the local notable Marcos knocked over a crate of empty fishing pots near the storage and cursed loudly. Men turned. A scuffle of feet and the clank of tin masked the sound of Enya sliding past the officials. She moved like a cat and slipped into the alley. The traveler watched her go and felt a quick blade of fear. If she were caught, she would be named and punished. The crowd's attention had been pried open and two men dragged a crate into the doorway to block sight. This was the first of several small, orchestrated moves designed to alter outcome. Enya returned with one folded sketch pressed into her palm and handed it to the traveler in the dark of a back corridor. "Keep it closed," she said. Her voice was a tight thing. The traveler put the scrap into his inside pocket and rubbed the seam with his thumb. The payment for such a risk often looked like a whisper or a nod. A sympathetic notable shared a coin with the ferryman, and a small corporal stepped away from the open trunk to buy a drink, eyeing his boots. Those choices by secondary characters changed the direction of the day. The traveler had not acted alone. The village had at least a pocket of people who preferred preservation to simple safety. Their choices raised stakes. The magistrate's men had taken visible pages, but not every page. The traveler felt a slim victory and an undercurrent of dread. The next morning, a public inventory notice went up in the square. The magistrate wanted names of anyone who had sheltered outside her records. That announcement moved rumor like a current. People came forward to speak in low tones. Some offered names out of fear. Others lied to obscure where papers had been hidden. The traveler moved among them and recorded what he could by asking pointed, factual questions. Who bought bread for whom? Who fixed Havel's cart? When did Mira burn the ledger last? He wrote the answers in precise sentences. The act of asking was his small way of preserving the concrete facts that would likely be stripped to lists and dates. He knew language could save a person when it described an action, who did what and when, rather than condemning them in generalities. At midday, the eldress pulled him aside near the hearth and spoke without raising her voice. "You carry danger, stranger, Mira. We burned ledgers not because we wanted bone." Dry silence, but because the last ledger put people's names into the magistrate's hands. Havel lost a son, Lisa lost a husband. "I cannot go through that again." She looked at him and the lines around her eyes moved. "You are not one of us. Still you draw our doors. Why do you keep doing this?" He thought of the ledger that had burned in the previous chapter and answered with the only concrete reason he held. Because the ledger that burned showed who the magistrate punished. "My notes show who lives and where they set bread to cool. If we do not save that, there is nothing to prove that a man was a baker and not a thief." Mira's fingers brushed the edge of a cup, and she seemed to measure the possible outcomes. Her reaction, hesitation that then hardened into a decision, changed the room again. She chose to test the villager's will, not surrender entirely. Later, when the magistrate returned with a younger deputy and a writ that demanded immediate handover of all sealed packets, the situation came to a head. Sorrel's voice was exact. "You will open all pockets and hand over outsider records now." The traveler looked at Enya and saw how her jaw clenched. He had to choose. Hand everything over and lose the small scrap, hide it and risk arrest, or attempt to leave. He thought of the ferryman and the skiff, and the way Joran had taken his money with a grunt. He thought of the burned ledger and the old woman's face, and his choice narrowed. He would not flee with everything. Instead, he pushed the seam of his coat and let the scrap slip under the cuff of a borrowed glove that Enya had tied at his wrist. Then he stepped forward and surrendered the trunk the magistrate demanded, letting the officials bat through visible pages and call names aloud. In the doorway, while Magistrate Sorrel's men were marking dates and stamping inventories, Marcos and a sympathetic notable created noise and confusion. Two men argued over a crate. A clerk misfiled a paper. Under that countable disturbance, Enya slipped behind an official and passed a folded sketch into the traveler's inside coat. The exchange was motor, quiet. A hand, a fold, a tuck. The traveler felt the scrap press against his ribs like a small heartbeat. Then an unexpected rupture. The magistrate's deputy looked up and called out, "Wait. This page bears the traveler's hand." The room pivoted. Traveler, Sorrel, eyes hard, "Show us the rest." A mini cliffhanger lodged in the middle of the chapter. Would they discover the hidden pocket? And every person in the room leaned with that single question. Enya slid a crate over the deputy's line of sight, speaking to Marcos in a tone no one but him and the ferryman could hear. They rapid back and forth, kept to the demanded rule of quick exchanges. "Move the crate now." Marcos hissed, "Do it." "Now, I will move it when they turn." "Enya." Then I slipped the page. Her movements were precise and timed as if rehearsed. Enya bumped the crate. It toppled. Men scrambled to right it. The deputy turned and cursed. In that fraction, the traveler turned his body away from the open trunk and palmed the seam. He felt paper slide into his hand and saw the deputy's brows knit as if sensing a tremor. Sorrel barked an order and men hurried back to their stations. The moment of discovery passed. The scrap remained hidden. The crowd exhaled in small, animal sounds. After officials left with their inventory and stamped receipts, the traveler walked out toward the pier as late afternoon fell. He opened the scrap only when he was alone by the water and the pyre creaked under his boots. The sheet held a sketch of the village green and the notation of one house where a girl kept a tin of buttons. It held a name, Lisa, and a date. He read aloud simply so the act fixed the details in his mouth. Lisa, tin of buttons, third day after the storm. Speaking the facts felt like filing them into his own memory in a way ink could not. He decided in that moment to copy the page, send it beyond the country's reach, and keep certain names by memory in case every paper was taken again. The shift here was practical and resolute. Anger became a steady determination to preserve concrete evidence by any means possible. That evening he met with Joran on the pier at dusk. The ferryman had a small lantern and a sack with a few coins. They sat side by side on damp wood and Joran spoke in the dry rhythm of someone who had watched other people's crossings. "You cannot keep everything on your person forever, Joran, but I will take papers where they will be less noticed. I will cross at odd hours. I know men who take goods across the ferry and do not ask questions. For a coin, I will take one packet beyond the district." The traveler slid a folded copy into Joran's hand. "Copy 3 more, he said. "Send them north by different hands." The ferryman's face set like rope. "You ask a price for danger," he said. The traveler gave names and the route with short directions, the kind of instructions that read poorly on paper, but worked in practice. On the pier, under a small lantern, the traveler wrote down a list of names from memory, naming who lived where and who owed bread to whom. He spoke each name aloud and Joran repeated them back to confirm. Havel, Lisa, Mira's son Thomas. The act of reciting was concrete. He set each name to an action the village had done that could be checked later. Fixed wheel, delivered bread, took shelter. Joran, "If they ask, say these were simple business notes, not a registry." Joran grunted agreement. Then the traveler folded the list into oilcloth and handed it to the ferryman. They made plans for staggered crossings and different hands to carry the copies. This practical arrangement showed collective agency rather than heroics. People exchanged concrete tasks to preserve records. Before leaving the pier, the traveler watched Enya from 2 boats away. She stood by the quay with a small bundle of cloth and a look that had the steady calm of someone who had decided. She lifted a hand to him and he lifted his in return. In that small signal there was no grand speech. Enya had risked a scrap, Marcos had made a diversion, Joran had promised crossings, and the eldress had not surrendered every secret. Their combined choices had shifted the day's outcome. The traveler felt relief sharpen into a quieter sorrow as he realized how narrow their preservation would be. He had saved a scrap, not the ledger. He had recorded bread sizes and names, not entire registers. The practical result sat in his coat like something alive and fragile. The final action of the day was small and decisive. The traveler shoved off in the skiff while the sun set on low, and Joran pushed away with a single long stroke. The traveler watched the quay shrink. He held the folded scrap and the oilcloth packet of names. He had decided to send copies beyond the country's reach and to keep some names in his own memory. He pulled his cap down and tucked the brass ink pot into the satchel, as if anchoring it against bad weather. Behind him, on the quay, voices rose and then receded into the normal roughness of village life. The magistrate's men would inventory and name and claim much, but they would not find every seam. At dusk he paused on the water and opened the scrap once more. The sketch showed a hearth, a low chair, and 3 chalk marks on the lintel. The notation read, "Thomas Men's Nets." Bread left on sill at dusk. He copied the sentence onto a clean sheet and folded it into a hidden fold inside his satchel. Then, with the lantern low, he told Joran the first names to take north on the first crossing. The ferryman rowed with steady arms. The traveler watched the shoreline until boats and salt washed it away from view. He felt the emotion shift again, from resolve into a tired steadiness, a careful acceptance of what could be saved and what would be lost. He could not unmake the magistrate's inventory. He could not put the burned ledger back together. But he had protected a scrap and set in motion a plan to scatter copies beyond reach. That plan would demand small, repeated acts by others. A coin handed to a ferryman, a crate knocked over to distract, a scrap slipped into a coat. The choice to rely on others' practical actions rather than a single dramatic confrontation showed a different kind of preservation. The traveler closed his eyes for a count of breaths, and then opened them to the stripe of shore. He fingered the seam in his coat and tightened the hidden packet against his chest as the skiff cut toward open water. The last scene of the chapter is an action. He pushed off and the boat moved away, carrying a single rescued scrap and a map of names memorized in one man's head.